tribal warfare and brutal actions, conquistadors and imperialistic forces, all the way to modern conflicts with advanced warfare. Throughout human history, war has been an ever-present stain on the dealings of human cultures. This has led many philosophers to speculate that some innate degree of violence is responsible for these actions across so many groups. This myth has been propagated by world leaders and dictators alike to advance their nefarious schemes and backdoor dealings. Scientists have held decades-long debates about why this is the case, with theories on our instinctual survival mechanism carrying over and bleeding into everyday life, all the way to an inescapable moral failing due to religion and culture. So why do societies in general simultaneously condemn violence as a tool for barbarians, as well as consistently show and state their need for it as a tool? Well, what if you've been taking a too broad and general look at the reasons for these conflicts? And the truth is much easier to explain and rationalize. Let's start with a story. In ancient times, your tribe was running out of food, and it would take far too much manpower and time to turn the undeveloped grounds around you into farmland. So you have to go explore the world and nature around you. While on a hunting trip, you come across another village. There, they have the resources you need: tenable farmland, a nearby water source that can sustain newfound growth, and a stable population. But how would you go about trading with them? It's impossible to know what their language is, and written forms of communication are limited and resource-heavy in this age. A hunter from your party tries to greet them, but you don't even know what body language to use. There's a cultural clash, and he's pierced by a stray spear. Your party runs back to the village, regaling the elders of tales of the hostile village with the resources your people need in order to survive. They struck first, thus you must go to war. So it's easy to see how conflict can arise in early agrarian societies. However, relatively quickly, civilization found many of the structures we use today. Large encampments like Mesopotamia are built with mass industrialized farming, and a large enough populace and enough resources to cultivate new lands frequently. Trade with different languages was now commonplace due to the first supply chains being routed. There should be much less of a need for war. However, we know that during this period, conflicts were near constant in separate and almost unrelated biomes of humanity. Well, that's where the start of the influences that would plague us to this day occurred. Ancient kings were most often chosen by theocracy or divine birthright. This was much before the days where it was socially commonplace to have some form of representation from the people in the rulings of the upper class. What do you think happens when you tell someone that they were chosen to rule over a village of hundreds or thousands of people from birth and your will and bloodline are royalty? Well, you tend to get people who can become a little bit narcissistic. However, this is where the sneakiest of all tricks is played on the human mind. It is well known that over time, dopamine receptors adjust themselves to stimuli and create new default hierarchies. This natural phenomenon is part of the reason that depression rates among wealthy individuals is so high, and so many entrepreneurs with more money than they can ever spend work so many hours still. It's reasonable to assume that in the past generations, this phenomenon could lead someone to work towards warfare and conquest as a method of achievement. And due to the limitations of information and control of the spread of knowledge, it would be fairly easy for an individual to convince key members of the government or their village as a whole that war was necessary and a crucial step for the continued existence of their cities. This is in combination with the fact that warfaring clans have the greatest survivorship rates, simply for the fact that over time, you're more likely to spread your culture and leave behind ancient artifacts to be discovered if you're spread out against more places, more climates, and use more intricate methods of communication. Take, for example, a small fishing village in the Bronze Age that got wiped out due to natural disaster or overfishing. It's much less likely that they're going to make the history books and have artifacts that can be preserved for a long enough time to be discovered and officially recorded. Therefore, it's much more likely for a historian to take note of conquerors rather than people who may have lived in a relatively peaceful time. Even still, a lot of the reasons for conflict remain. Although trade with others of a different language and culture are definitely more possible, it is still easier and much less complicated to take over and assimilate the resources of smaller peoples. However, one might wonder, why then, in the modern ages, with our open lines of communication and frequent dialogues with those of different countries and mass democratic access to resources, that we still wage war? Is it because of some innate flaw that plagues the human soul, burning away at the cores of society and that dooms us ever to fail? Well, most likely not, due to the simple fact that we as a species continue to advance throughout time, ever increasing human rights, quality of life, and advancing and expanding technology. So I think the answer is far more simple. Even with democracies and more meritocratic forms of government, simply put, the type of person who wants to be a leader is someone who is always predisposed to launching warfare. In the modern democratic era, to gain political power and support, you must be well liked and in tune to the pulse of millions of people. You are usually raised in elite private schools and study rigorous economics, separated and disjointed from the average worker. And then something too about the natural way of society must upset you so deeply that you feel that you're the only one who both can acknowledge the problem and has the intelligence and capabilities to fix the issue. These character traits can cultivate themselves in textbook narcissists. And what greater way for a narcissist to show their abilities and fulfill their sense of superiority than conquering a great plague scourging a nation? This is one of the reasons that there is such a strong propensity for world leaders to be so disjointed from the populist way of thinking. Most average people want to live their lives, enjoy varying degrees of economic stability, and work a satisfying and fulfilling job. We clearly have more than enough resources to do so, yet our leaders are constantly preoccupied in land disputes and petty vengeances that have no real basis or need. However, this is not to say that we are all blameless in this predicament. Far too many times are people too afraid to speak out against ruling or mob thinking, being content to blindly follow their leaders in order to try and fit in and maintain cultural hegemony. It is far too easy for populaces to be trapped in internet thought bubbles and closed loops of thinking, riling them up against imaginary enemies or offenses. With human communication being the most open and free that it ever has, there is no longer any excuse for these grave misunderstandings and broad generalizations of the populace. This tendency for us to generalize and revert ourselves back to our tribal way of thinking is often exploited by our leaders, since they have an innate knowledge of this fact due to their intense and consistent study on the dynamics of large populaces and the motivations behind large swaths of people. While yes, our conditions and human biases do make us capable for war, something that is both historically necessary and a clear survival mechanism, I believe there is no great natural human inclination for warfare or establishing dominance over other cultures, since in any structure, whether democratic, oligarchical, or monocratic, the methods of collection and pooling of power will always choose leaders who have a greater predisposition to war than the average person. The way we select those who can declare war is flawed innately, leading to a perpetual loop that stains humanity's hands. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe.